Okay, so we're going to be working in actually like building a Rails app from scratch. And a big part of the reason for that is I want you guys to see how easy it is with Rails compared to Sinatra. I don't know if you're like me, but when I was going through Sinatra, I got to a point where I thought, I am so tired of writing the same thing over and over and over again, especially like if you've made your app a little bit bigger. Quickly it can get away from you and you just feel like you write the same thing a million times, like the get, the route, the do, what ERB template to load. And so you are not alone in feeling like that. There are other people who have felt that same way. And back, I think it was invented in 2002, but in 2005, the Danish developer, David Heinemer Hansen, almost shares my last name, so I feel like it makes sense that I love Rails so much, basically came up with Rails, or a framework that does a lot of the repetitive work for you. And so previously, it took quite a bit of time to build a full-fledged app because you had to write all the separate routes and the separate configuration, and how does this table talk to a model and talk to its route. David came through and created Rails, which essentially made the process like 1,000 times quicker. And so it's a really, really neat framework that you guys get the chance to use and to learn. It's still relatively new, but is something that is widespread and used. And I'll share this link out later. It's like his presentation of it. And a few other things to kind of like, 2003. So he presented it 2005, developed it in 2003. You'll hear different opinions on Rails. Some people don't like that it's so recent, but also there are huge major websites and companies that are using it. So here you can see a list. You've been using GitHub, obviously. Most of you probably use Airbnb, Square, Kickstarter, Artsy, Zendesk, Goodreads. All of these are built on Rails. They might be using other technologies as well, but their base framework is Ruby on Rails. So knowing Ruby on Rails will get you far in life. I just want to pass that on. It is a popularly used language. It just has, you'll find people with different opinions about it from all over. And actually I misspoke there, and this is one of the things that I was going to get to, but Rails is not a language. It is a framework that uses the language Ruby and a few other languages as well. But in general, what Rails is it's a framework implemented as a Ruby gem that will allow you to make web applications using the same MVC pattern. So we talked about the model, the view controller pattern in Sinatra, where you have the models of the kitchen in the back creating what you need, your controller, that's the waiter going back and forth between the customer, and then the view, what actually gets presented to the customer. We're still going to use most of the patterns that you learned in Sinatra. And one of the really big things that I would challenge you to do as you go into Rails is to try to over and over again connect what you're seeing in Rails to something you've seen in Sinatra, because there are a lot of similarities between the two, and there are differences, but there are connections of how both of them operate. So we really use Sinatra so that you can see what's under the hood in Rails and get a better picture of what's going on in the background, because a lot of Rails is essentially going to do work for you. And I'll show you in a minute how with like 2 lines of code, I can have pretty much a fully fledged web app, or an app almost to the level of like your Sinatra projects in like a matter of 5 minutes. And so it just is, it's going to be an amazing tool to have at your hands. And then a big thing that is on here that I want to emphasize is that Rails follows this pattern of, that says convention over convention. That is not right. It's supposed to say convention over configuration. I don't know how it got changed to that, but follows a pattern of convention over configuration. And that's this idea of I could let everyone like make up their own routes and their own way of doing things. But that means that every time you sit down to make a project, you have a lot of decisions to be made. What should we call the routes? What should we call the views? How do we connect all of these pieces? And so in Rails, the priority is on convention. And a good example of that is a few of you guys I worked with in Sinatra. I looked at your apps, you had wonderfully working apps, but I told you, I know this isn't going to change the functionality of your application, but it's best practice to go through and change your views to say index.erb and show.erb and new.erb. Those are conventions, and they're conventions that don't really matter in Sinatra, but matter a ton in Rails, because Rails is built on this idea that all of us developers are following the exact same conventions. So there's code built in that says, oh, you called this file index.erb. I know that's where that should match with the route that shows many things. And so if you guys remember from Sinatra and RESTful routing, that route would be like, if we were talking about posts, for example, it would be /posts. And those conventions that we also taught you about routing, post/id, post/id/edit, they're conventions that weren't as necessary in Sinatra, but are very necessary in Rails, because Rails does a lot of inferring for you and is able to infer that this route, based on the way it's written, is an index route and should match an index controller action and should match an index view. So there are a lot of conventions that you'll have to stick to. Things between like, is your model named singularly or is it named plural? And that your table is named plural. Those things are gonna really matter. And so there's a little bit of, you just have to follow the patterns that are already built in there for you, and your life will be so much easier. Does that make sense, the convention over configuration? I realize I can't actually see most of your faces, so I don't know if that clicks, but we'll say, any questions about convention over configuration? Okay, we got some yeses, cool, thank you. So going off of that, Rails is not a programming language. It is just a framework that is going to allow us to build apps quickly using Ruby. And we'll actually, I think, jump over a lot of the things that I have in here, I actually put in here just to share out with you guys afterwards for you to look through to see what the different folders do. Actually, let me go ahead and share it now in the chat so you can look through it. But mainly we're actually going to be working in the terminal, and we're going to build ourselves an app. Let's make it so any of you guys can see this. So we've kind of already covered in Sinatra what's MVC, this idea that we use a model, view, and controller and keep our concerns separate. And then as it continues down here, it's going to go through a few pieces of the Rails file structure. And I think they're important to go through and look at, but I actually want to do it in a little bit more of, we're going to be playing with the application. I just have those there for you guys to take a look at if you want to. And our focus today as we go through this is I want you to continuously think about how is this similar to Sinatra? How is this different from Sinatra? So that's the thing I'm going to challenge you to like keep in mind as we go through this. So let me pull up my terminal. So to get Rails up and running, the first thing you would want to do, and you can do this from anywhere on your terminal, is to do gem install Rails. I am not going to do this right now because I already have Rails installed. And when I did this last night, I didn't realize that I was actually working on Rails version 4 and there is a Rails version 6. And it threw a whole bunch of issues, but I just want to emphasize, to get started, this would be your first command that you would put somewhere in your terminal. Once Rails is installed, you have, and I can show you guys, I have Rails. Oh, that's going to break anyway, so that's okay. I thought I had deleted it. I think I have an earlier version of Rails. Oh no, I do have Rails 6.0.2. And so that's the newest version of Rails that's out, and it comes with a lot of cool stuff. It comes with the ability for you to use Webpacker and some other tools that we might not cover in Flatiron, but would definitely be something you could spend some time diving into a little bit deeper on the side if you wanted to. Once we have Rails installed, the next thing that we're going to do is we're simply going to say Rails new. So very similar to Cornel new or bundle gem. All of those were using the same kind of command line, and actually Sinatra, the Cornel gem, was built a little bit off of the idea of how Rails worked. They wanted something similar to this option in Rails. And then we'll just make a new application. And Chris, I'm going to steal your idea and do shoes because I think it has a lot of options off of it. So we're going to make a new app and we're just going to call it shoes. Pretty boring name. And then as this runs, you're going to see it creates a ton of stuff for us. And it's even going to go through and run bundle install. This is where my computer has been giving me a little bit of issues. If it does, I've got a backup plan. But as you look through here, it has created all of our files and folders for us, just like Cornel did. There are definitely a few more files and folders than we saw in Sinatra, but a lot of these are going to look the same. So we still are going to deal with an application controller. We still are going to deal with views, and we do have like a layout view. We will deal with models. So a decent amount is going to be very similar, and the core pieces will be pretty similar. Okay, good. This is moving. This last night I had an issue where that would not move. So if you are working on Rails and you get to this part and it gets stuck on resolving packages, please message me. I have figured out how to debug that. So those little pesky environment issues, I do want to just kind of tell you that they are something that every developer has to deal with, and it's not like, oh, just because this Flatiron lab is a different version than mine. Any of you guys who have struggled with version issues in your journey so far, you are going to be so much better prepared for dealing with them down the line, because it's like always a thing, because packages continue to update. So just wanted to throw that out there. Don't be discouraged if you've ever had to deal with those issues. You're actually probably a little bit better prepared for what you'll have to deal with in the long run. This is really taking it quite a bit of time. I think it's almost there. There we go, nice. Now we aren't actually in our folder yet, but we can CD into this folder that it made, and I'm going to show you really quickly just all of the pieces that it has created for us. So like I said, it's pretty similar. A lot of the core of your work is going to be done in the app folder, which is, I would say, comparable to how we did it in Sinatra. There are definitely a few more folders in here. So we have assets, and this will be places where you will put CSS, style sheets, or images that you want to load. I have not used channels, but I believe that it is for, why am I blanking on the name? The Webpacker WebSockets. That's what our channels will be used for, but we won't deal with them here. Controllers, action cable, yes, thank you. And then our helpers. Any JavaScript that gets added, which we won't have to deal with yet, but if you wanted to add some in, then we've got a folder for it. This is where you could put jobs that run asynchronously in the background, another folder that we won't touch. Mailers, I do have a lecture on how to use mailers, and they're pretty cool. They're a functionality in Rails that will send out emails from your application, and so it's a pretty neat option. And then obviously our models and our views. When you get started, you can focus on just the 3 folders that you are most familiar with, our controllers and our models and views, and that's where you're going to stay most of the time. Similar to Sinatra, when we start the server, you can make changes in your app folder and you don't have to restart the server, as long as your changes are in this folder. If your changes are outside of this folder, most likely you'll have to restart the server. There's been a few weird instances where it like works and you don't restart it, but in general, you'll have to restart the server. So that brings me to our next point, is how do we start the server in Rails? It's even a little bit easier, I would say, than shotgun. We just use the command that says Rails and then S for server. And we don't have really anything in our project yet, so we won't see much when the server starts. All we will see, let me bring us over, is we'll just see the welcome to Rails. Except for my local host runs very slowly when I am doing a Zoom call. There we go. Nice, and this is also a big difference, is typically Rails uses the port 300, whereas you guys were using the port 9393. They do that on purpose, so you could have different apps running at the same time on different ports. Very similar in the way that we can navigate in here in Rails, but we have nothing built right now, so we might as well work on building something. So I'll go ahead and close this. There's one other really cool piece of Rails, and that is that we have a console. So you are used to using text to check on your models. We will use the Rails console, and very similar to the server, we'll just type in Rails and then a C. And this is like a rate console. It has access to your databases. Any changes to your database that's made in the console will then be noticeable when you actually go to your site in the server. So it's a way if you wanted to like add in extra data or delete data that you didn't mean to add and you haven't made a delete route yet, the Rails console is a place to do it. At the moment, we can't do anything in the Rails console because we have no models. So the next thing I want to show you is something that I think is really, really neat, but I need to give you guys a warning. What I'm about to show you is something you can try to test out. It is 100% off limits for using for a project. You will probably see why we consider it 100% off limits for a project. Basically, it does all of the work for you. And to be fair, it's a little bit frowned upon actually in developer circles to use what I'm going to show you too often, because you'll end up with more stuff than you need. And as a developer, you don't ever want to make your app have like extra files and folders and things that you aren't using. You want to really build to what you're using. And you typically, like if you have 5 models in your application, you aren't going to have 5 fully built out controllers with 7 routes and, you know, views for every single one of those models. You'll probably pick and choose, and some will be fully fledged out and some won't. And so for that reason, what I'm going to show you is something that we just are going to use for demonstration today, and we will not use it again. But I just want to show you how quickly. It could, Nelson, if you have like a ton of extra stuff in there, you definitely could potentially slow down your program. So just like with that Cornel gem, we have some generators, and there's a wide version and range of how much your generator is going to do for you. We are going to use a Scaffold, which is the most heavy duty generator there is. It will basically like build everything for us. So I'm going to go ahead and call this shoe right here. And this is where like I know how to do this because I have the documentation to show me how to write this method. And it shows me how to follow the conventions that it's expected. And so this is the convention that it's expecting here. And actually, I saw you do this in yours, Chris, and I think it was kind of a cool mistake. So our model should be named singularly, but I just want to show you what happens if I do name it with a plural. And then we actually can name the attributes that would go in the model. So I might say brand and call it a string. I might do size and say integer. And then I might say color, string, and let's do limited edition Boolean. So we've got a true or false there. And when I go ahead and hit enter, this is going to do a lot of work for us. And let me go ahead and send out one of your best friends in Rails is going to be the Ruby guides. And what I just sent out to you guys has all of the command line, why can't I think of the word for it? tools, code that you could use. And that's where you could find how to write this Rails generate scaffold. It did intentionally misspell shoes as plural because I wanted to just point out this error of how smart Rails is. Rails looks at this and says shoes was a plural, but you need to use the singular shoe instead. So we are going to override it and use shoe. You can go back and override it if you want to, but we think you messed up and you actually meant singular shoe. I would encourage you not to test Rails to see if they'll catch your mistakes, but to actually just try to follow conventions in the first place. I just knew that this one would work. And it does build a lot of stuff for me. And so you can see we have a lot more stuff here than we might necessarily need. So let me show you what it's built. We have now a folder for shoes, and we have all of these forms. And there's some different things in here that we actually won't even like cover, like you see this JSON JBuilder. And so it's already given me more stuff than I would need. Because if I was doing this for my project, I would want to get rid of all of these JSON JBuilder ones because I'm not using that right now. We're not using JavaScript yet. And but some of the other pieces are pretty cool that they've already included a partial form for us. You'll learn about partials. If any of this is overwhelming, just know I'm trying to give you like an overview of what's to come. You don't have to remember all of this stuff right now, just to show you kind of the power of Rails. But so this has built a lot of stuff for you. And I think it's a little bit cooler to see actually in the views itself. So we'll go into our server. And we're still going to see this same name page once my server actually connects, which is not yet. When I get here, when this does actually load, I want to go visit my shoes index page. Oh, don't give me the error that I thought. Oh, that's okay. We can deal with that error. We forgot to migrate, and actually migrations will be done the same as Sinatra. So you have two options. You could run Rails DB migrate, or you can run Rake DB migrate. They actually both work the same. And so it's your preference which one you would prefer to do. And I should have actually pointed out, we did get a migration built for us. That Scaffold did all of this work for us. So it named our migration, and then actually listed out all of the data types and the name of our columns for us. And this is where we talk about convention. It knows conventionally that if our model is singular, our table is going to be plural, which is why it forced our model to be singular. And you can see we have our shoe model in here as well. Okay, let's restart the server. And I'll go back to the question I was going to ask you. I want to visit the page that has all of the shoes. What would I expect that URL to be based on the conventions that we tried to teach you guys in Sinatra? So we've got two separate things happening, and this was confusing in Sinatra. So it would be shoes, but what you guys brought up there, index is the view that we'll be using. And so it did create a shoes index, and that's the view, but we'll actually, the route will just be /shoes. And so cross our fingers that this works, because I was having some weird issues, but I know how to fix it if it persists. Come on. Nice. Okay, we're in. Notice I haven't written any code. The only thing that I wrote was that command here. I did a Rails DB migrate, and I also did this scaffold generator. Those 2 lines of code, and I already have an app that has an index page up and running for me. And what I think is even cooler is if I go to shoes new, notice it follows the convention we would expect. I have a form built for me.
It's
and
lovely.
Yeah, it's like, this part to me is like, yeah, take a second to be amazed by it, because I think it's really cool. It basically was like, what do developers have to rewrite every single time? What tends to be written the same every single time? okay, let's make it so we can just build all that for them. It's very cool. So we'll go ahead and we'll fill out this form just to see how it works. And notice it did some neat things. It made this like a number form field for me. We're gonna make some pink shoes that are limited edition, and it kind of, yes, it does make the developer lazy. You are right. This is why you cannot use it for your project, but it's kind of a cool, like maybe after you graduate, like it's a good way to get projects like up and running off the ground. So yeah, and we'll go ahead and we'll click create shoe. Before I hit create shoe, the checkbox will default to true when I click it, yes. And so that's their default way of using it. Good question, Jesse. When I click create shoe, if we follow RESTful conventions, which Rails does, what should the route be that it submits to? This one's kind of a tricky question. Yes, so it will submit to the /shoes method and it will be a post. And we might not see that, so I'm just gonna show you by inspecting the page really quick. And so let's look at it. Oh, yep, we can already see it. So you can see this form itself. It will post to shoes, method post, form shoes. There are a few different new things in Rails that you'll learn about, like this authenticity token to make sure our forms are not hacked. One thing I do like to point out, and we'll go into more detail in the future, but I just want to point it out now, is you're going to be using a lot of helpers in Rails. And what that means is, in an effort so that you don't have to write things that don't look like Ruby code, like in an effort to make more of your code Ruby and less of your code HTML, there are all of these helpers where you write Ruby code and it generates HTML. And it'll be true for writing links. You can write Ruby code and it will generate a link for you. It's true for forms as well. You write Ruby code and it generates a form. That part can be a little bit confusing because there's a little bit of behind the scenes magic going on. You write Ruby, you go to your web page and you see HTML. When I got stuck in that portion, one of the things that I found that really helped me, so I just want to like get this on your mind, is going to the server and inspecting the page, because it is always writing plain HTML for you. You always see the HTML that actually gets written as a result of your Ruby code. And to kind of give you an example of what I mean is I'm going to actually pull up the form and we're going to compare these side by side really quick. We can see them both. So here is let's look at just the brand one, for example. For this brand, we see form.label, form.text field, brand. But over here, we actually see our old school things that we know, a label, and then an input with a type and a name. And they have built in that name spacing for us, which is something that we'll see quite frequently. And so just to give you guys a heads up, if you're ever unsure what you're writing in your Ruby code with helpers, just look at the page in the browser and inspect the page and compare the two. I think it helps give a lot of understanding and assurance of what's happening. So also a pretty cool thing in Rails, we actually use the same form for edit and for create, or edit and new. And the reason is because in some of those Ruby form helpers, they have built in the ability to say, is this object that we're making the form for, is it a new creation or is it already in the database? And it like basically changes the form whether or not it's a new creation or already in the database. So lots of magic in Rails. I personally love it if you can't tell. So we'll go ahead and we'll create the shoe. Shoe is successfully created. Really, we have like a fully fledged site already happening here. Maybe I forgot I'm really a size 9. And I thought it was limited edition, but it's not. I'll update and we go back and we see this. Notice in our routes up here, we're also following those conventions. Shoes/1 shows us our first shoe. If we go to shoes/edit, that will be our second shoe. I don't know where we can see maybe we can't see the delete. Oh, from here. So we can also delete our shoe if we wanted to. So it did all of our CRUD actions for us, and now we're back to no shoes. I want to take a pause because that's a lot of stuff that I've covered. As you guys are sitting here watching this and thinking, any general questions that pop up?
Yeah. If you do like generate scaffold goose, will it know that the plural of goose is geese?
Yes, it is very, very, very smart in that. And part of it is on that PowerPoint that I showed you that I don't even know where it is. One of the things that it's using actually brings in other Ruby, like enhances your Ruby library of code. So it has methods like pluralize. And so, for example, let me open a new tab and go into the console. I swear my computer is 1,000 times slower when I'm running Zoom. It's not this slow when I'm working on my own. So for example, I saw a goose. Let's see what happens if I do pluralize. I spelled that correctly. Oh shoot, that didn't actually do it correctly. So maybe let's, you know what, let's just try it. Rails generate scaffold goose. We'll just do name as a string. Yeah, a lot of them they do correctly. I know ones that end in S, they definitely do correctly. It looks like goose they did not do correctly. Because
so if you wanted to fix this, is there like a way to rename the table so it knows it goes with goose model, even though it's called, like, you would call it geese and it would be expecting like gooses?
Man, that is a brilliant question. And I actually don't think so. I mean, I think there is. Do I know how to do it? I don't know.
Could you possibly add to pluralize method?
I know I get what you're saying, but yeah. They're probably, Chris, do you know? I'm thinking about
Sorry,
it.
what was it?
So the idea of like, for most things, like this does do the correct pluralization. Like I believe like for like syllabus or something like that, it will change it to syllabi.
Yeah, and octopi. There's actually, if you open up, if you go into the console right now,
Mm-hmm.
and you just type in a Rails console, you can actually take any string, so type in syllabus or octopus, and then just call .pluralize on it.
So that was what we were just doing.
Oh, sorry.
But the thing was, these aren't giving me what I would they're not giving me what I would expect.
Yeah.
And
I think that I remember there are some of them that are just like weird and messed up.
And so the question was really, is there a way to force it? Like, if you really want to name your table geese instead, is there a way to force it so that Rails still knows that this table is connected with the goose model?
I think you would have to use like an alias or something in the model and say like, yeah, force the table name. But I don't think you could get the table name to actually match. I think you could just reference it in your application differently, but I think on the I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah, because I remember working with one student that had a weird instance like that of the way that they pluralized something was weird. Like Ruby's natural pluralize was weird. So they just kind of had to like shift to those conventions.
Right.
So it is a little bit of that convention over configuration. It's a little bit harder when you want to do something that doesn't exactly match their conventions. It's probably not impossible, but it might take just a lot of extra work.
Yeah, because Rails is expecting it to match its pattern from the way that we write the migration to the way the table is named, how the model is written. So yeah, you kind of just maybe, yeah, you're right. I don't know. I'd have to look into it further. And I don't think that these types of model names happen that frequently. But yeah.
Lucy's
I'm not
planning
100%.
a goose tracking project.
Or a syllabus creator. Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. What I would say is you typically won't run into an issue if you are using generators. And I know we said you can't use the scaffold one, but there is a generator that just generates your model and your migration. And there's another one that does your model, your migration, and your routes. And so some of those like simpler generators we do encourage you to use. And all of those generators, like the way we use this other one, we'll put in the singular and they'll decide what the plural is. And so then you'll just kind of go with what they give you is my advice in there. But I don't know, I'm curious to a better answer for your question, Lucy, but not positive off the top of my head. And then Jesse, you said, can you rename the migration file or does that break everything? You can definitely rename it. It might break some, I guess I'm trying to think of like why you would rename it. So you could rename it if maybe you had done, you had generated this migration and then you go, actually, I didn't want to call that a goose model. I wanted to call that a horse model. And you could change it to like horses, create horses, and you would probably be fine. It does very specifically need to match of this name should be the plural and this table name here should be the plural and our model should be the singular. Yeah, you're right. The user would never see the table name, so they don't have to know that your backend code is calling them gooses. They would see in the front end you calling them geese, and so it'd be totally fine.
That's a good point.
Yes, you would end up with some weird routes though, because your routes would probably be like gooses / just because of the way that they do conventions. And I think part of it is like conventionally it's easier if they just add the S onto the end, and then they have a few particular things like person and people that are probably more commonly used that have weird pluralize that they change. But good question so far. So that just reminded me there's one other piece that I really want to make sure we go over, and that is the controller, because this controller is going to have some interesting things in it. So right off the bat, I want to kind of get your guys' opinion. This is what was created for me. Obviously, there are some big differences. Anyone want to kind of like unmute themselves and talk about some of the things? Take a second to take this in. What are some things that you notice that might seem odd? Or how is this different? How is it similar to Sinatra?
So like the difference is clear, like that it's all more Ruby-like that it looks like, you know, we're defining an index method instead of doing like a get or post for it. So yes, that looks pretty cool.
Yeah, exactly. So this is like a way easier. It looks much more like any Ruby method that we would write. It doesn't have, you know, the get, shoes, do, and doesn't like, this looks a little bit more like, I don't know, not Ruby. And so we have rewritten it to now look a little bit more like Ruby. Nelson, I was waiting for someone to also mention that one. There are no ERB references. And exactly, Andrew. So all of these methods have an implicit render. What that means is like, sure, I could write ERB index. Do I put now I'm like losing my mind. Do I put the colon here too? Okay, the way I had it first was, so we could do this, but the way that Rails works is as long as we're naming our things following conventions, it does the work for us because it thought that was a repetitive thing that we didn't need to write in every single one of our methods. So what it will do is whatever this method is called, it will then look for, in our views, it will look for a folder that matches the controller. So we're in the shoes controller, so it will look for a shoes folder. And then it will look for a file that matches the name of this controller action is what we call them, our controller actions. And so we could write def like surprise. And then we could make a view that says surprise, and it would look for that matching view. So it does, this works by just knowing that whatever the name of our action here is, it will be looking for the name of a view that's similar. There's a little bit extra going on here because of all of these JSON pieces and our JavaScript, but for now, you don't have to worry about those pieces. So Jesse and Lucy also pointed out a really important piece for us. And we kind of have two things happening for us. So it looks like we don't have to set our like @shoe, like normally we would see @shoe equals shoe dot, find params ID. We would see something like that. We don't have that in here. It is in here, but I didn't show you all of the controllers, so you couldn't have known that. It's in here, and what we have is like a private helper method. So these methods are methods that are not controller actions. We don't want them to be confused as like, oh, I'm looking for a set shoe view. We want these to be known as just helpers. And it writes a method that will do code that's repetitive down here. So anytime you find yourself writing the same thing over and over again, it's better to write that as a private helper method. And then it has this really nifty command that I'm sure a lot of you guys would have found helpful in Sinatra after writing the same thing over and over again. And it is a before action. And so it is saying we are going to do this method. So it's going to do that line of code before the show, before the edit, before the update, before the destroy. So that's the first line of code that runs for all of those methods that are specified in this block. And so there is code happening for the edit, we just don't see it. Also, one thing that's pretty cool is technically it actually even implicitly knows, I think it's going to yell at me if I try to do something with migrations pending. Let me go ahead and migrate really fast. Show you that rate db migrate works as well. And then I might have to restart the server. But what I wanted to show you is that even these, and it's good practice to leave them in, but Rails can actually even work without this. I'm actually wondering if with the before action, if it will work or not. We'll see. We'll test something out. Okay, let's see. First, let's just make sure and see. Let's make a new shoe. Okay. And we're just going to make, honestly, we'll do lime green this time. Here's shoe 2. I just want to see what happens if we comment this out. Being that set shoe is set an instance variable, can we just dot that method to get shoe attributes? Do you mean the set shoe method? So yeah, but you no longer have to do that now, Cindy. Like what set shoe is doing is it's setting this instance variable. So now in all of our views, we have access to @shoe. Technically, yes, we could do set shoe.brand. It just, there wouldn't be like a good, I couldn't argue a good reason for doing it that way. This is like, has one singular principle, and it is to set our instance variable. So our instance variable has value in the views. And so in the views, we can do @shoe. And these methods defined like this actually are not accessible in the views. There are different ways you can write them, similar to Sinatra, to make them accessible in the views. You can do like a helpers do block or something like that. So let's see. So I just commented out this get the def shoe, and I want to see if this still works. It usually does, but I just wanted to double check. Cool. So it is better practice to leave it in because it could confuse another developer later on. But technically, if nothing is happening inside of that view, you don't even need this controller action, because it's just smart enough that it knows from the route which action and which view it's loading. So it still works even with that commented out, which I think is like a really crazy thing about Rails. Let me see if in the controller there's anything else I wanted to point out before we move to the routes. We will handle params a little bit differently from forms, as you see. Will take a bit till you get to that part, but just know that we will be handling params a little bit differently as well as and when we get there. I think that's about it for the controller. Any questions on our shoe controller? Okay, let's move to the routes. This is one of my favorite parts. So where we're going to be writing routes this time and where we're going to be dealing is inside of our config folder. And this sets up a lot of stuff for you. Later on, you'll have labs where you change things in here and add different settings. There's an initializer that you'll change at some point. But for right now, the place that I want to take you to is to this routes file. And so this did two things for me. In 2 lines of code, it has defined 14 routes. So technically, this is a shorthand for defining 14 routes. And to prove that to you, there are 2 ways you can look at the routes. One, and I actually always forget how to do this correctly, so let's see if I can get there. I think this is right. Yes. So one, anytime you're in a server, you can go to rails/info/routes and you'll see all of the routes that are made. This is my favorite way of looking at it because I think it's the easiest to read. And what they define for you is the controller action. So we can see all of our gooses and their controller action and all of our shoes. Oh, and we have these routes are built in with some of the active storage and active mailer. You can ignore those routes down there. We have created 14 routes, which are these. And they'll follow our normal conventions. So if you're ever unsure, like what is the convention for a route, you can use resources and you'll see these 7 made. And you'll see that a few of them share the same format. So these 4 all share the same format, but have different HTTP verbs. So we get the get, the patch, the put, and the delete. That all would go to the same exact route. So it's kind of nice because we don't have a ton of routes. We have this plural one, we have the plural/new, the edit, and then the regular show. And it just makes your life a little bit easier because those are your only options unless you want to add a custom route. You'll learn a little bit more about these path helpers, but these are where I was talking about we can write our links so that they look more like Ruby code. All they'll do is they'll actually just generate your URL for you. So if we were to type in like redirect to Goose's path, it would be the exact same thing as redirect to /Goose's. It's just a different way of writing the same thing. And because our routes know about our controller action and our index, that's why in our controller, we technically didn't need the action there and it still was able to find our view. So this is where like all of our definition goes. Another way, if you forget this, is you can also in your terminal say rake routes, or you can say Rails routes, either one, both commands work. And because I have all these extra routes, we're gonna see those as well, but we'll see ours first. And this is slow. You might be wondering, what if you don't need all of those routes? Let me make this a little bit bigger. So this is the same chart, it just is in your terminal. The exact same chart. I just think it's a lot easier to read in the browser. But both 2 ways of getting that, and this will be a tool and a debugging tool that you should use quite frequently. This is just shorthand for writing out all of the routes, and there might come a time where you don't need all 7. And I will warn you now, if you do not need all 7, you should not have all 7. So if you are only ever going to show an index page of the gooses, it should look a little bit like this, where you say, we are only going to have an index page. If I was to rake routes again, and we'll let it process for a second, but if it was to rake routes again, we would now only see 1 route for our gooses. We can also write these out ourselves. And so what they look like a little bit ourselves, and sometimes I forget the syntax for this, so if I mess it up, I'll have to do a little bit of debugging. But you can actually set the path. So anytime I see the plural shoes, that is going to direct me to the controller and to the action. So it's going to take me to the shoes controller, and our action would be index. And this is the long form way of writing out the first route in here. We can also write post shoes to, I really feel like shoes create, and then we have some more options in here. I want to test those out because I'm a little bit worried that so now we only have the gooses. And now that we have these, I'm going to actually comment out our shoes. So now we really should only have 3 routes altogether. If I haven't messed up, we might get a syntax error. Because Rails is so convention based, those Ruby on Rails guides that I set out earlier are really important to reference, because your syntax matters to match a convention more than anything else. And we might have gotten it correct because I didn't see an error. Cool. So now we just have 3 routes, and these made the same routes that were happening in resources. So essentially what resources is doing is it is a shorthand way of generating all of these lines of code. Just a different way of dealing with your routes. Migrations will be very similar to Sinatra. That's one place that you don't really have to worry. It'll pretty much work exactly the same with your rake db migrate and rollback and seed. All of that is the same. The biggest differences are probably your routes and your controllers. Your models and your views work pretty similarly as well. We've got about 5 minutes left. Does anyone have any pressing questions about Rails? Is it overwhelming to see all of this, or is it more exciting? If you had to choose one of those words to describe how you're feeling about Rails right now. I think it's exciting, but I think it also can be overwhelming. So, okay, cool. That's what I was hoping for.
I actually have it's not super Rails related, but I guess for there, when you're customizing your routes and like how it reads, could you, like if you're doing a query, instead of having like the question mark equals and the string afterwards, could you change the slug to look like something like just the name of the query you're looking for? You know what I mean? Just clean it up, I guess is what I'm saying.
So I do know what you're saying. That question mark, that format that you see is usually a result of submitting a form via a GET request. And that is the convention of how you pass in that information. If you want to make it a true form that gets submitted as a post request, you won't see that question mark, but it's no longer like a shareable link. Like you could make a custom route. I 100% get what you're saying. Where maybe you submit a post request and that redirects to your custom route so that it's shareable. But I will also say that you don't really want to go away from the already standing conventions, and like the normal convention is just to add the question mark and the params, because it makes it really easy to share that link with other people and to know exactly what they're seeing and getting, because they can see both the keys and the values of the params that are being passed through. But the question marks only happen when you submit a form via a GET request.
Got it.
One thing that did make me think of that I just want to note is the order actually does matter in here. You normally won't have to deal with it because if you use resources, they'll put them in the right order. But if you remember in Sinatra, it was really important that we did like get shoes new before we did get shoes ID. Because if we do this the other way, new will always be seen as an ID. I just want to point that out because I've seen sometimes people come in and they make custom routes. You're more than welcome to make a custom route, and it will be like maybe get shoes / favorite, and they put it at the bottom, and because they put it at the bottom, it never gets read because above there they had resources shoes, and so it got matched to the ID first. So a good practice is a lot of custom routes that you write you would put your custom routes first, or you just want to still think about, very similar to Sinatra, how the order mattered in your controller. The order no longer matters in your controller, the order matters in your routes. So just kind of a change of where you want to think about that. Cool, any last call for questions? And then if nothing else, we'll wrap up. Okay, sounds good. I apologize again for the way the study group being the wrong date. You'll have study groups on the right date posted later today and not too long. Sorry about that. And I'm excited for us to get into Rails. So if you guys do think of any questions, feel free to post them in the Tech Questions channel, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Thank you, Jen.
No problem. Bye, guys.